The train screeched to a halt with a hiss of steam, its iron wheels grinding against the rails. Clara pressed her gloved hands to her chest, feeling her heart thud beneath the lace bodice of her wedding gown. The ivory fabric shimmered faintly under the late morning sun, and her veil fluttered with a warm breeze that swept across the dusty platform. She had imagined this moment for months. Her groom waiting at the edge of the crowd, eyes alight with love, ready to take her hand and begin their life together. She stepped down from the carriage, careful not to soil her hem on the cinders, her gaze scanning the small gathering of townsfolk. Faces turned toward her, curious, some smiling, others whispering. Then her eyes found him, Thomas, the man she had promised herself to. But instead of the warm, proud expression she had pictured, his lips twisted into a smirk that made her stomach drop. He stood with his hands in his pockets, leaning lazily against a post, a few of his friends snickering beside him. Well, Thomas drawled loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Looks like the city sent us a porcelain doll. His companions laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Clara froze, the blood rushing to her cheeks. She forced a smile, unsure if this was some ill-mannered joke. "Thomas, it's me," she said softly, stepping forward. He didn't move to greet her. Instead, he let his gaze travel over her gown, her gloves, the small trunk at her feet. "You really came all this way dressed like that? Did you think we were still getting married?" His words hit her like a slap. Murmurs rippled through bystanders, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Confusion gripped her. The letters, the arrangements, the promise. Had it all been nothing? "I don't understand," she whispered, the train's departing whistle ringing faintly in the background. Thomas shrugged, a coldness in his eyes. "Changed my mind. Thought you'd figure it out when I stopped writing. Guess you're not as sharp as I thought." He tipped his hat mockingly, turned on his heel, and strode away with his friends, their laughter fading into the hum of the street. For a long moment, Clara stood rooted to the platform, unable to move. The chatter of the townsfolk surrounded her, some voices pitying, others judgmental. She could feel their eyes on her, burning into the lace of her gown, the flush of her cheeks, the trembling of her hands. Her throat tightened, and she fought the tears that threatened to fall. A small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve nearby. "Mama, why is she dressed like a bride?" The woman shushed him, glancing quickly at Clara before steering him away. It was as if the entire platform had shifted, pulling away from her, leaving her stranded in a circle of silence and shame. Her trunk, heavy with all she owned, sat awkwardly by her feet. She could barely think. Only fragments of thought flickered through her mind. The weeks of preparation, the fare she had saved for the ticket, the way her mother's hands had lingered on her shoulders the morning she left. And now, nothing. A gust of wind tugged at her veil, nearly pulling it free. She caught it instinctively, clutching the sheer fabric to her chest. Around her, the townsfolk began to drift away, their curiosity satisfied, their gossip already forming. She could almost hear the words they'd carry into the saloons, the general store, the post office. Bride left at the station. City girl too foolish to see it coming. Clara swallowed hard and forced herself to breathe. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She reached down to grip the handle of her trunk, though her hands trembled so much she could hardly hold on. She had no plan, no idea where she might go in a town she had never seen before, in a gown that now felt like a costume for a cruel play. Somewhere in the distance, a horse's hooves clopped against a dirt road, steady and unhurried. She didn't look up. Not yet. All she could do was stand there, trying to gather the shreds of her dignity, as the weight of her situation settled over her like a heavy, unyielding blanket. The creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic clop of hooves carried over the platform's uneasy quiet. Daniel Hayes, a tall, broad-shouldered cowboy with weathered hands and eyes the color of a storm about to break, guided his buckskin mare along the dirt road that ran beside the station. He wasn't looking for trouble. He rarely was. But years on the trail had taught him to spot it from a distance. And right now, the trouble stood in the form of a young woman in a wedding gown, rooted to the platform like she'd forgotten how to breathe. He slowed his horse without thinking, his gaze catching the faint tremor in her shoulders, the way her hands clutched the veil against her chest. The townsfolk were already drifting away, but not without throwing her lingering looks over their shoulders. Some smug, some pitying. Daniel had seen this before, in one way or another. Life had a knack for breaking a person in public, where everyone could watch. He reined in near the edge of the platform, tilting his hat back just enough to get a clearer look at her. "Miss," he said, his voice low, steady and polite. She blinked, startled from whatever fog she'd been lost in, and turned toward him. Up close, her face told a story without words. Humiliation still raw, pride holding back tears. I'm fine," she said, though her tone wavered. She reached again for the handle of her trunk, but it was obvious from the strain in her arms that it was far too heavy for her to carry far. Daniel swung down from the wagon with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life working the land. "Doesn't look fine," he said simply. He didn't crowd her, didn't push, just stood there waiting, giving her space to decide if she'd speak. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then, almost like the words slipped out before she could stop them, she said, "He left? My groom. Changed his mind." Her eyes darted away, ashamed to even let a stranger hear it. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "That's so." He glanced toward the direction the man had gone, but the street was already empty. "Well, that makes him a fool." The words were simple, but the kindness in them seemed to knock something loose in her chest. She swallowed hard. "It's not safe for a woman to stand here alone," he added after a pause. "Town like this. Gossip travels faster than the wind, and not all the folks who hear it will be kind." "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel glanced at her trunk, then at the empty seat beside him on the wagon. "I'm headed west. Could take you as far as the next stop with a decent boarding house. You can figure things from there." She hesitated, studying him. A stranger offering help could just as easily be a danger, but there was nothing in his eyes that hinted at anything but quiet decency. He stood like a man who didn't need to prove himself, just offer what he could and left the rest to you. Finally, she nodded. "All right." Daniel lifted the trunk into the back of the wagon, as if it weighed nothing, then extended a hand to help her up. She took it, feeling the calluses against her palm, steady and real. Settling onto the seat, she kept her gaze forward, not daring to meet the eyes of the few lingering townsfolk. As Daniel clicked the reins and the wagon rolled forward, she could feel the stares prickling her back. The whispers rose behind them, half pity, half scandal. "That's the bride Thomas left. Who's that man with her?" She didn't waste time finding company. Daniel didn't look back, but he could feel the weight of the gossip, too. "Best thing about wagon wheels," he said lightly, "is they only roll one way." She glanced at him, surprised by the hint of humor, and for the first time since stepping off that train, the tightness in her chest loosened just a little. The town faded behind them, replaced by the open stretch of prairie, golden under the afternoon sun. The wind carried the scent of wild sage, and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves filled the quiet between them. For a long while neither spoke. Finally, Daniel asked, "What's your name?" "Clara," she said softly. "Clara," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Daniel Hayes." She nodded, tucking the name away in her own mind. She didn't know where this road would take her, but for now, she was no longer standing alone on a platform, drowning in whispers. She was moving forward, and that was something. The prairie sky had a way of turning from gold to gray in the blink of an eye. One moment, the sun hung warm and steady overhead. The next, thick clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with rain. Daniel noticed it first, his eyes narrowing at the way the wind shifted, cool and sharp against his face. "Storm's coming," he said quietly, glancing at Clara beside him on the wagon seat. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach tighten. The horizon was darkening fast, the kind of darkness that meant trouble for anyone caught in the open. The first gusset them hard, tossing Clara's veil back and sending strands of her hair whipping across her face. Daniel tightened his grip on the reins, urging the mare forward. "There's no way we'll make it to the next town before it hits," he said. "My place isn't far, just a small ranch. We'll ride it out there." Clara didn't argue. She could already see the curtain of rain sweeping toward them like a wall. By the time they turned off the main road and onto a narrow track, the first drops had begun to fall, cold and insistent. The wind howled as they approached a modest cabin with a slanted roof and a corral off to one side. The house wasn't much, just weathered wood and a porch with one leaning post. But in that moment, it looked like the safest place in the world. Daniel hopped down, boots splashing in the mud, and helped Clara to the ground. "Go on inside," he said over the roar of the rain. "I'll see to the horse." She hesitated at the door, dripping and chilled, watching him move through the downpour with calm efficiency. He rubbed down the mare, led her into the small barn, and tossed fresh hay into stall before finally jogging toward the house. Inside, the cabin was plain but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth coal for now, and a small table with 2 chairs sat near the window. A few shelves held worn books and a scattering of tools. It was a space built for one man, not for company. Daniel shook the water from his hat and set it on a peg by the door. "Let's get you warm," he said, kneeling at the hearth to strike a match. Soon, a fire crackled to life, filling the room with a soft orange glow. Clara hovered near it, holding her hands out to the heat. The warmth seeped into her fingers, chasing away the ache of the cold rain. "Thank you," she murmured. He shrugged, busy hanging his coat to dry. "No thanks needed. Storms like this don't care who you are. They'll knock the strength right out of you if you're not careful." She glanced around the cabin again, taking in the small touches that spoke of his life. Boots neatly placed by the door, a clean stack of firewood, a warm but well-kept saddle resting on a stand. Everything had a place. Everything was cared for. Daniel ladled hot water from a kettle into a tin mug and slid it toward her. "Tea. Not fancy, but it'll do." She accepted it, wrapping her fingers around the mug and letting the steam curl against her face. It had been hours since she'd had anything warm, and the simple kindness of the gesture settled something deep inside her. The storm raged outside, rain hammering against the roof and wind rattling the shutters. Inside, the quiet between them was not uncomfortable, just careful. Daniel sat across the table from her, sipping his own tea, his gaze steady but not prying. After a while, Clara spoke, her voice tentative. "You didn't have to bring me here. Most men would have left me at the station, let me figure out on my own." Daniel set his mug down. "Most men aren't worth their salt," he said plainly. "My mother taught me better than that." She studied him, noticing the way he said it without pride or pretense, as if it were just a simple truth. Respect and selflessness weren't something he put on for show. They were part of who he was. Later, as evening settled in and the fire burned low, Daniel pulled a blanket from a trunk. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Clara's eyes widened. "I couldn't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "It's just one night. You'll rest better there." She hesitated, then nodded, touched by the quiet chivalry in his tone. In a world where too many men took advantage, Daniel's respect was as unexpected as it was disarming. When she finally lay down in the small but clean bed, she could hear the wind outside and the steady sound of Daniel tending the fire. Somewhere between the safety of the blanket and the steady rhythm of the storm, she realized she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time since stepping off that train, Clara felt the faint stirrings of trust. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under the pale sunlight. Clara stood on the porch of Daniel's cabin, her borrowed shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the calm. But as they rode into town later that day, the stillness ended. Daniel needed supplies, and Clara, though reluctant, agreed to accompany him. The moment they reached Main Street, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Women glanced up from their baskets, whispered behind gloved hands. Men tilted their hats in greeting, but some exchanged knowing smirks. It didn't take long for the gossip to begin. Clara overheard one voice, sharp as a knife, remark to another she was seen leaving his ranch this morning. Alone. Imagine the nerve. She kept her gaze straight ahead, refusing to let the sting show, but Daniel noticed. His jaw tightened and his voice dropped low. "They don't know the truth." Don't let them decide your worth. Inside the general store, Clara tried to busy herself by scanning shelves of flour, coffee, and dried beans, but the murmurs followed her like shadows. Two older women near the fabric boats fell silent as she passed, their eyes flicking from her to Daniel and back again. She felt like a scandal wrapped in human skin. When they finally left the store, she asked softly, "Is it always like this here?" Daniel glanced at her, then away. Small towns remember everything and invent the rest. They rode back in silence, the wind cool against their faces. Once inside the safety of the cabin, Clara sank into a chair, the morning's humiliation weighing heavier than the storm's rain ever had. Daniel busied himself unloading the supplies, but he could feel her quiet hurt filling the room. She broke the silence first. "I suppose I should tell you why I came here in the first place. The real reason." He set the sack of flour on the counter and looked at her, waiting. "I was engaged," she said, her voice low, steady at first but trembling at the edges. "An arrangement between our families. I thought it was my chance for stability, maybe even happiness. But—" she swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "On the day I arrived, he refused me, in front of everyone, said I wasn't what he'd been promised." Daniel's brows drew together. "What does that even mean?" "That I wasn't as pretty as my photograph, that I seemed too opinionated for a wife." A bitter smile touched her lips. "The truth is, he just wanted someone who'd never question him, someone quiet and obedient. I wasn't that." Daniel didn't speak for a moment, just leaned against the table, watching her with an intensity that felt like both understanding and anger on her behalf. Sounds like a coward hiding behind a gentleman's coat. Her laugh was short, humorless. It wasn't just rejection. It was humiliation. And the moment I stepped off that train, I realized there was no going back. My family's too far, and I didn't want them to see me as a failure. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You're not a failure, Clara. That man wouldn't know a good woman if she was standing right in front of him." For a moment, the firelight caught at her eyes, and she wondered what exactly Daniel saw when he looked at her, because it didn't feel like pity. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "I know what it's like to have someone walk away." She tilted her head, curiosity softening her expression. "You?" He nodded slowly. "I was engaged once, too. Years ago. Her name was Rachel. We grew up together, and I thought we'd spend our lives here. But the first hard winter came. Cattle dying, money running out, and she decided she didn't want to live this kind of life. She married a banker in Denver instead." Clara felt a twist in her chest. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, but it was a kind of shrug that masked an old wound. "Happened a long time ago. But it teaches you something about people. The ones who stay through the worst. Those are the ones worth keeping close." Silence settled between them. Not heavy this time, but quiet in the way shared understanding often is. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling the grass around the cabin, and for a moment, Clara thought about how strange it was, how two strangers could find the same kind of hurt in different stories. When she finally spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. "Thank you for last night, for not making me feel unsafe." Daniel's gaze met hers, steady as ever. Respect shouldn't be something you thank a man for. It should be the only way he knows how to be. Something warm stirred in her chest then, something that had nothing to do with the fire. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was trust, and that was more than she thought she'd feel again. The morning sun spilled across the open plains, painting Daniel's modest ranch in a golden glow. Clara stood on the porch, her borrowed dress fluttering in the breeze, watching as Daniel worked in the corral. She had awoken early, determined not to simply be a burden on the man who had shown her kindness when no one else would. Her pride wouldn't allow her to sit idle while he carried the weight of the ranch alone. When Daniel emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in hand, she stepped forward. "Let me help," she said firmly, her chin lifting with quiet resolve. Daniel frowned slightly, glancing at her delicate hands. "You're a guest, Clara. You don't need to," but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "I do. I need to earn my keep, Daniel. Please." Reluctantly, he agreed, and soon they were walking the fence line together. The wood was weathered and some posts leaned, victims of last month's storm. Clara held the wire steady while Daniel hammered nails, the two of them falling into a wordless rhythm. Occasionally their eyes met, and each time something unspoken passed between them. A shared sense of purpose, perhaps, or the faint spark of trust beginning to kindle. Later, they fed the livestock, Clara carefully scattering feed, while Daniel filled the water troughs. She giggled when a stubborn goat nipped at her skirt, and Daniel found himself smiling at the sound. A sound he hadn't realized he missed until that moment. The laughter seemed to wash away some of the heaviness lingering over both their hearts. By midday, the sun beat down hard, and they retreated to the shade of the porch with cold water. Clara brushed a strand of hair from her face and looked out over the land. "You've built all this yourself?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Every post, every board. Took years, and I still lose more than I gain sometimes." His voice held no bitterness, just quiet acceptance. Clara understood. Life could strip you bare, but you kept going anyway. The rest of the afternoon passed in steady work. Daniel began to notice small things, the way Clara never complained, the way she took care with every task, the way her presence filled the silence with something warmer than he'd known in a long time. When the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of amber, they finished the day. As they stood side by side, watching the horizon, Clara turned to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but sure, "for letting me help, for letting me stay." Daniel's reply was simple but sincere. "You've done more than help, Clara. You made the place feel less empty." And for the first time since she stepped off that train, Clara felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely lost anymore. The day began like any other, a pale morning sun creeping over the hills, the smell of fresh hay drifting through the barn, and the quiet rhythm of chores keeping Daniel's mind steady. Clara was in the garden, sleeves rolled up, carefully weeding between rows of young shoots. But the peace was shattered by the distant thunder of hooves. Daniel straightened, his hand instinctively tightening around the handle of the bucket he was carrying. A lone rider crested the ridge, dust trailing behind his horse. Even before the man came into clear view, Daniel sensed trouble. When the rider finally slowed and dismounted in the yard, Clara froze mid-step, her face drained of color. It was him, Samuel Harland, the man who had left her humiliated on the station platform. His fine coat and polished boots stood in stark contrast to the rugged land around them. "Clara," he said, tipping his hat as though nothing had happened, "I've come to bring you back." Clara's voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "Back? After you mocked me in front of half the town?" Samuel's jaw tightened, though his tone remained smooth. "People talk, Clara. You've been staying here, with a man you barely know. Your reputation's in tatters. If you come back, we can fix that. I'm willing to overlook your lapse in judgment." Before Clara could answer, Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between them. His voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "You left her standing on a platform like she was nothing. You don't get to waltz back and pretend you're doing her a kindness." Samuel's gaze shifted to Daniel, narrowing. "This isn't your concern, cowboy. I'm offering her a way out of disgrace. What can you give her?" Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "Respect. Something you clearly don't understand." The words were quiet, but they carried enough weight to draw a small crowd, neighbors and passers-by who had stopped to watch the scene unfolding in the yard. Samuel took a step closer, his tone sharp now. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know her like I do. She belongs with her own kind." Daniel squared his shoulders. "She belongs wherever she chooses to be. And from where I stand, it doesn't look like she's choosing you." The tension thickened, the silence between them broken only by the restless stamping of Samuel's horse. Clara, though shaken, stepped to Daniel's side, her voice firm. "I am not a prize to be won back. You didn't want me then, and I certainly don't want you now." Samuel's jaw worked, his pride clearly stung under the eyes of the gathered townsfolk. With a final glare at Daniel, he swung into his saddle. "You'll regret this, both of you," he muttered, before yanking the reins and galloping away. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring about what they'd witnessed. Daniel turned to Clara, concern etched on his face. "You all right?" he asked. She took a deep breath, her shoulders loosening. Yes, because you didn't let him shame me again. And as the last echo of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clara realized something. Daniel wasn't just a man who had been kind to her in her lowest moment. He was a man who would stand in front of her when the world tried to knock her down again. The night after Samuel's visit was restless for Clara. She lay awake in the small guest room of Daniel's ranch house, the wind rattling the shutters like an impatient hand on a door. Her mind replayed every word, every smirk from Samuel, and every murmur from the gathered townsfolk. Reputation. That curse word seemed to hang over her like a noose. Down in the barn, Daniel couldn't sleep either. He leaned against a post, the lantern casting warm light across his face, lost in thought. He knew the weight of public judgment. He had worn himself after his own heartbreak years ago. He didn't want Clara to feel trapped here, even if that meant losing her. By morning, the air between them felt taut with unspoken questions. Over breakfast, Daniel finally broke the silence. "Clara," he said gently, "if going back with him will make your life easier, I won't hold against you. I don't want you staying here out of pity or fear." Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You think I'd choose comfort over dignity?" she asked quietly, setting it down. "Daniel, going back to Samuel might make the whisper stop, but I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I'd bet myself to fit someone else's pride. I can't live like that." Daniel's gaze softened. "And staying here? That means more gossip, more stares in town, maybe even trouble. Folks don't forget quickly." She looked at him then, really looked. The man who had offered her kindness when no one else had, who had stood between her and humiliation twice now. "Trouble I can handle," she said, her voice steady. "Being unloved, disrespected, that's something I can't bear." They spent the afternoon mending a section of fence together, neither speaking much. But every shared glance, every quiet moment, seemed to carry a new understanding. The choice was no longer about reputation or safety. It was about whose side she wanted to stand on when the world grew cruel. As the sun sank low, painting the hills in gold and rose, Clara stepped onto the porch and found Daniel leaning on the railing. "I've made up my mind," she told him. "I'm staying. Not because it's easy, because it's right. Because I'd rather face the worst with you than the best with him." Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and let out a slow breath. Then, with a quiet smile, he said, "Then I reckon this place just became your home, too." The words settled between them, not loud or dramatic, but strong, like the foundation of something that could weather any storm. The next week, the air in town fell heavier. Whispers seemed to follow Daniel everywhere he went. To the general store, the blacksmith, even the feed shop. Samuel had been busy, spinning tales about Daniel's questionable morals, and painting Clara as a naive girl caught in the web of a drifter. Daniel bore it quietly, jaw tight, never once lowering himself to argue in the street. But Clara saw the way his shoulders stiffened when people avoided meeting his eyes, the way conversation stopped when he entered a room. She knew this wasn't just gossip. Samuel was trying to ruin him. By Friday, word had spread that Samuel would be at the town meeting, and Clara felt something in her snap. Enough was enough. She wasn't going to watch Daniel's good name be dragged through the dirt while she stood silently by. That evening, the meeting hall was packed. Lanterns swung from hooks, casting flickering shadows over the crowd. Samuel stood near the front, leaning against the wall with the smug grin of a man who thought he'd already won. When Daniel walked in, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to him, and then to Clara, standing just a step behind. Before anyone could speak, Clara stepped forward. Her heart pounded in her ears, but her voice was steady. "I know there have been things said about Daniel," she began, meeting the gaze of every person she could. "And I know some of you believe them because it's easier to believe a familiar face than a stranger. But I was there. I know the truth." A murmur ran through the room, but she didn't stop. She told them how Samuel had left her standing alone on the train platform, mocked her in front of half the town, and only came back when he feared for his reputation, not hers. She spoke of how Daniel, a man she'd never met before that day, had shown her kindness, respect, and shelter when he had nothing to gain. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then Mrs. Hargrove, the widow who ran the bakery, rose from her seat. "I've known Samuel since he was a boy," she said slowly, "and I've never once seen him speak of others with respect. But I've seen the way Daniel looks at you, Clara. That's a man with honor." A few others nodded, murmuring their agreement. Samuel's face darkened, his jaw tight. He muttered something under his breath and stormed out, the door banging shut behind him. Daniel turned to Clara, eyes unreadable. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly once the meeting ended. "Yes, I did," she replied. "You've been standing up for me since the day we met. It was my turn." As they left the hall together, the stares they felt from the townsfolk weren't filled with suspicion anymore. Some people even tipped their hats or offered small smiles. The shift was subtle but real. By the time they reached the wagon, Daniel glanced over at her and said, "Looks like the wind's finally changing." Clara smiled softly, knowing it wasn't just a town that had changed. It was the way they now stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next. The sun was sinking low, spilling gold and amber light across the rolling pasture. Daniel sat on the porch, his boots resting on the bottom rail, a quiet cup of coffee in his hands. The air smelled faintly of hay and the last traces of summer rain. Clara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as the evening chill set in. For a while they didn't speak. They just sat together, watching the slow dance of shadows stretch across the land. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, and the wind carried the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Daniel glanced at her, the way the light caught in her hair, the way her hands rested in her lap, and knew the moment he'd been holding back couldn't wait any longer. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he began, his voice low but steady. Clara turned to him, her eyes curious, waiting. He shifted in his chair, as if the words were heavier than any saddle he'd ever lifted. "The day I found you on that platform, I didn't know what you'd come to mean to me. I figured I'd offer you a ride, maybe a warm place to stay until you got your bearings. But every day since, you've filled this ranch with something I didn't think I'd feel again." Clara's breath caught. Daniel, he shook his head gently, not wanting her to stop him. "I thought I'd bury my heart with the woman I loved years ago. But then you came along, and I saw strength where others only saw a broken promise. I saw kindness in the way you treated this place like it was already your home. And somewhere along the way, I realized I've fallen in love with you, Clara." Her eyes shimmered in the soft light, and Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I'm not saying this because you need a place to belong, or because I think you owe me anything. I'm saying it because I want to spend my life with you, as my equal, my partner, not out of pity, but out of love and respect." From the pocket of his worn jacket, he pulled a small velvet pouch. Inside was a simple gold band, a little scuffed from age, but polished until it caught the porch light. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "She used to say it carried the weight of real promises. Clara, will you marry me?" For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The crickets, the wind, the fading sun, all of it held still as Clara's lips trembled into a smile. Her eyes brimmed with tears, and she nodded, unable to find her voice. When she finally spoke, it was a whisper. "Yes, Daniel. Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his rough hands trembling just a little. She laughed softly through her tears, and Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They sat there a while longer, leaning into each other as the sky deepened into night. No grand speeches, no crowd to witness it. Just the two of them, the creak of the porch boards, and the quiet vow that whatever storms came their way, they'd face them together. And as the first stars blinked awake overhead, Daniel thought to himself that for the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel so empty, and neither did he. The day dawned with soft golden glow spilling over the hills, the kind of light that promised calm skies and warm memories. Weeks had passed since Daniel had slipped his mother's ring onto Clara's finger, and now the ranch buzzed with quiet excitement. There were no carriages lined up along a grand street, no ballroom hung with glittering chandeliers, just a wide-open prairie, the sturdy wooden barn, and the people who truly mattered. Clara stood in her small room, smoothing the simple ivory dress she'd sewn herself. The fabric was soft and plain, but the care in every stitch made it more precious than any silk gown. Her heart raced, not with nerves, but with the joy of a future she never imagined possible. Outside the window, she could hear the faint twang of a fiddle being tuned and the rumble of friendly voices gathering. Down in the yard, Daniel was making sure everything was set. He wore a freshly pressed white shirt, his best dark vest, and a pair of boots polished enough to catch the sunlight. The way his hat sat low over his brow couldn't hide the spark in his eyes. He'd faced drought, debt, and loneliness, but this was the first time in years he felt truly rich. The ceremony took place under the old oak near the house, its branches wide like an embrace. Close friend from town and a handful of ranch hands stood in a loose circle, smiling and whispering. A gentle breeze tugged at Clara's veil as she walked toward Daniel. Her arm looped through Mrs. Thompson's, who had insisted on giving her away like a proper daughter. The preacher's words were short but heartfelt. When he spoke of trust, loyalty, and choosing each other every day, Clara felt Daniel's fingers tighten around hers. They exchanged vows in plain language, no rehearsed poetry, just promises born of quiet understanding. When Daniel kissed her, the small crowd erupted in cheers and clapping, the sound carrying across the open fields. The celebration was as unpretentious as the ceremony. Tables of food set up in the yard, music drifting from a pair of fiddles and an old guitar, laughter ringing out as people danced on the packed earth. Clara twirled once in Daniel's arms, her veil catching in the light, and for a moment the world seemed to spin only around them. Later, as the sun dipped lower, the guests began to wander off, some waving from their wagons, others lingering to share one last cup of coffee. The ranch settled into that peaceful hum of twilight. Daniel saddled 2 horses while Clara changed into her riding skirt, the fabric swaying against her boots. He handed her the reins with a grin. "Thought we in a day the way I found you, on the road, with nowhere to be but together." They rode side by side, the horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm over the dirt trail. The horizon was awash in colors, deep rose, gold, and a hint of purple where the night waited to take over. Daniel glanced at Clara, the glow of the setting sun brushing against her face, and felt a swell of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The wind in their hair, the smell of the grass, the steady warmth of the other's presence. It was all the language they needed. Somewhere behind them lay the echoes of gossip, the sting of old wounds, the shadows of solitude. Ahead was nothing but open land, the promise of hard work, and a love that would weather both sunshine and storm. As the last rim of the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel reached over, brushing his gloved hand against Clara's. She smiled, leaning closer as the horses carried them forward, the sky above turning to a blanket of stars. And so they rode on, not toward some distant destination, but into the life they had chosen, a life built on trust, on courage, and on the quiet, unshakable promise that they would face every sunrise together.